Hi everyone. Tonight we're giving up your walls, your street address, and your firm belief that a house should stay exactly where you left it, and moving into a round felt tent in the middle of the Mongolian steppe. This is a world where your living room can be dismantled before lunch, where breakfast occasionally starts as milk and finishes as something with a noticeable kick, and where the nearest neighbour might be visible on the horizon, but is still a 2-hour ride away. Welcome to life among the Mongol nomads, at the exact moment their empire is swallowing the known world, one horseback messenger at a time. Before we saddle up, if you're enjoying these late-night wanderings, feel free to like the video and subscribe, though only if it's actually earning it. Leave a comment and tell me where you're tucking in from and what time it is on your end, because apparently there is no hour on this planet when someone isn't quietly listening to a stranger describe felt tents. Now go ahead and dim things down, get yourself settled, and let your ceiling slowly rearrange itself into a lattice of wooden poles and stretched wool. Because tonight's roof does not plug into anything, and it is not going to apologize for that. Let's sit with a few questions before we go any further. Could you pack an entire household onto the backs of a few camels in under an hour and still remember where you put the good bowl? Would you trust your digestion to a bucket of fermented mare's milk that's been quietly working itself up for days? Could you find your way across a landscape with no roads, no signs, and not nearly enough trees to count on? And how would you feel about your morning commute being a horse you've technically been riding since you were old enough to sit up? Well, congratulations. You've just opened your eyes inside a ger somewhere on the endless Mongolian grassland, and the year is 1220. Genghis Khan's empire is expanding faster than anyone in Europe or China is comfortable with. Your neighbours have already relocated twice this season, and somewhere just outside the door, a horse is waiting for you that has covered more ground this year than you have in your entire life. Welcome to the steppe. Try to keep your bearings. Let's start exactly where you are, because you haven't even sat up yet. The tent around you is round, low, and surprisingly sturdy for something made of collapsible lattice walls and a few dozen felt blankets. Sunlight leaks in through the small open circle at the very top of the roof, the same hole that lets smoke out and tells you roughly what time it is without a single clock in sight. The air smells like wool, wood smoke, and something faintly dairy that you'll get used to whether you want to or not. It's cozy in the way a very small, very well-insulated drum is cozy. And you're about to learn that this entire structure, walls and all, can come apart in under the time it takes you to find your boots. You stretch, or try to, and immediately discover the ceiling has opinions about that. The whole structure is round, because round sheds wind better than corners do, a fact nobody explains to you until after you've already banged your head on a support pole trying to stand up too close to the wall. The floor beneath you is a layered arrangement of felt and hide rugs, thick enough to keep the cold from crawling up through the ground, which it very much wants to do. Somewhere near the centre, The ash from last night's fire still holds a faint warmth, and a family member is already crouched beside it, coaxing it back to life with dried dung and a patience you have not yet earned this morning. Outside, you can hear the muffled clank of a bell around some animal's neck, the low murmur of someone already talking to their horse like it owes them money, and the particular hush of a landscape with no traffic, no sirens, and no upstairs neighbour dragging furniture across the floor at 6 in the morning. It's the kind of quiet that modern life spends a fortune trying to recreate with white noise apps. Except here, it's just Tuesday. You notice too how little is actually inside this tent. A stove, some chests for storage, sleeping mats rolled and stacked against the wall, a small shrine shelf you were warned not to touch. There's no clutter, no drawer full of things you meant to throw away 3 years ago, because everything you own eventually has to fit on the back of an animal. Ever tried packing for a 2-week trip and realized you brought 4 pairs of shoes you never wore? Here, that mistake gets corrected for you permanently, because the tent itself refuses to carry your nonsense. By the time you've actually located your boots, someone has already started boiling water. The tent has gone from cold to bearable, and you understand, in a way you didn't 20 minutes ago, that this small round room is not a temporary shelter you're passing through. It's a fully engineered home, built by people who have spent centuries perfecting the art of living beautifully with almost nothing nailed down. Let's talk about moving day, which here isn't a once-a-decade nightmare involving cardboard boxes and a rented truck, but a routine event that happens several times a year, whether the household is ready or not. The felt panels come off the lattice frame in minutes. The roof poles get bundled like a giant amount of kindling. The whole tent, hearth and all, gets folded into neat loads and strapped onto the patient backs of camels and oxen who have clearly done this before and have opinions about doing it again. Somewhere between one grazing ground running thin and the next one calling, the decision gets made, and by nightfall, your entire home has quietly relocated itself to a spot that, to your eyes, looks exactly like the one you just left. You watch, slightly stunned, as a structure that took you 20 minutes just to properly wake up inside gets reduced to a stack of poles and folded felt in roughly the same amount of time. There's no debate about which items to keep and which to donate. No boxes labelled miscellaneous that never get unpacked at the other end. Everything has a place on an animal's back, assigned with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from doing this since childhood. Children hand pieces to adults. Adults load pieces onto animals. Nobody seems to be following instructions, and yet, somehow, nothing gets left behind. The reason for all this movement isn't restlessness, it's survival math. Grass gets eaten, water gets low. A herd of hundreds of animals can strip a patch of steppe bare faster than you'd think, and staying too long in one place isn't charming. It's a slow-motion disaster for the animals your entire life depends on. So, the household follows the grass, not the other way around, moving with a rhythm tied to seasons rather than a lease agreement. Ever tried moving apartments and sworn you'd never do it again because of one bad afternoon with a couch that wouldn't fit through a doorway? Here, that entire ordeal happens routinely, sometimes several times before winter fully sets in, and nobody treats it as a catastrophe. The camels shift their weight under the load, unbothered. The dogs trot alongside like this was always the plan. And somewhere in the new camp, before you've even caught your breath, the felt walls go back up in reverse order. The stove gets relit, and the tent becomes home again, as if it had simply been waiting for you at both ends of the journey the whole time. By evening, the fire is going, the milk tea is steaming, and the only evidence that you moved an entire household today is the faint ache in your shoulders and a newfound respect for anyone who's ever complained about carrying a moving box up 2 flights of stairs. Let's talk about where you're actually allowed to sit, because in a one-room home, geography is everything. The door always faces south, which sounds like superstition until you remember it keeps the wind out of your face on your way in. The back of the tent, directly opposite the door, is the place of honor, reserved for guests, elders, and a small shelf of family and spiritual keepsakes nobody touches carelessly. The west side belongs to the men and their gear, the east to the women and the cooking. You learn all of this the hard way, by sitting in the wrong spot once and watching an elder's eyebrow do most of the correcting for her. Once you've been quietly repositioned, you start noticing the logic behind it. The central hearth anchors everything, radiating both heat and hierarchy, since where you sit relative to that fire says something about who you are in the household. Move too close to the honored back wall without an invitation, and you've overstepped. Sit too near the door, and you've marked yourself as, at best, a guest still finding their footing, at worst, someone who might be asked to leave first if the weather turns. The east side, the women's domain, holds the milk buckets, the cooking tools, the churns for that fermented drink you'll be trying later whether you're ready or not. The west side holds saddles, bridles, tools and weapons, everything a man might need to grab quickly on his way out the door to deal with a wandering herd or an approaching storm. It's less a rigid rule-book and more a system so old it's stopped needing explanation. The way you instinctively know which side of the bed is yours, even though nobody ever formally assigned it. Ever walked into someone else's home and immediately, wordlessly known you weren't supposed to sit in a particular chair? This is that instinct, except codified across generations and enforced by people who will absolutely notice if you get it wrong twice. There's an efficiency to it too. In a single round room with no walls to divide function from function, this invisible map does the work that hallways and separate rooms do everywhere else. The cooking stays organized, the gear stays findable. The guests know exactly how honored they are without a single word being exchanged. By your second or third day, you find yourself unconsciously moving to your correct spot the moment you duck through the door, no longer needing the eyebrow to guide you. It's a strange kind of fluency, learning to read a room that has no doors, no signs, and somehow more rules about where you belong than any office you've ever worked in. Let's get you dressed, because the Steppe does not care that you're still half asleep. You wrap yourself in a deal, a long robe that closes at an angle across the chest and ties at the waist with a wide sash, doing the job of a coat, a blanket, and a very committed fashion statement all at once. Sturdy leather boots with upturned toes go on next, designed
as legend and practicality both suggest, not to damage the earth beneath you when you walk, and reinforced enough to survive a full day in a stirrup. The whole outfit is built for a life spent almost entirely on a horse, which is convenient because that's most of what today involves. The deal itself is a marvel of doing a lot with very little. In summer, a lighter version keeps the sun off. In winter, a heavier, fur-lined version becomes the only thing standing between you and a landscape that would otherwise be actively trying to kill you. The wide sash, cinching it at the waist, isn't just decorative. It supports your back through long hours of riding and doubles as a place to tuck a knife, a small pouch, or whatever else you need within arm's reach, since pockets, as a concept, have not really caught on out here. The sleeves run long, past the fingertips, which looks impractical until you're gripping cold leather reins at dawn, and suddenly understand exactly why. The colour and trim of your deal and the way your sash is tied can even hint at where you're from and what you do. A quiet visual shorthand that lets people read a stranger's background at a glance. The Steppe's version of noticing someone's accent before they've said a word. Then come the boots. Stiff, thick-soled, and curved up dramatically at the toe. Ever tried explaining to someone why your shoes look the way they do, and had the honest answer be spiritual respect for the ground? That's roughly the story here, alongside the far more practical benefit that a curved toe slides cleanly into a stirrup and stays there, no matter how much galloping is involved. By the time you're fully dressed, you've essentially been armoured for a full day of wind, cold, sun, and horseback, all without a single zipper, button, or piece of stretchy fabric anywhere in sight. It's less an outfit and more a wearable survival kit, refined over centuries by people who had exactly one shot at getting the design right before winter tested it for them. You step outside, sash snug, boots planted, and for the first time all morning, you genuinely feel ready for whatever the steppe is about to throw at you. The steppe, for its part, remains completely unimpressed. Let's talk about breakfast, which today, like most days, is largely liquid. A pot of milk tea, salted rather than sweetened, steams over the hearth, made from tea brick, milk, and a pinch of salt that would horrify anyone back home who's used to sugar in their cup. Alongside it comes a handful of arul, small, hardened curds of dried dairy that look unassuming and taste like a workout for your jaw. It's simple, filling, and portable enough to survive a horseback ride, which turns out to be the entire design philosophy of steppe cuisine. You wrap both hands around your bowl of tea, grateful for the warmth against fingers that are still adjusting to a morning without central heating. The taste takes some negotiation. It's savoury where you expected sweet, faintly smoky from the brick tea, rounded out by the milk into something that sits closer to a light broth than anything you'd call a beverage back home. By the third sip, it stops being strange and starts being exactly what a cold morning apparently requires. The arul, meanwhile, demands commitment. Dried until it's nearly as hard as a small stone, it's meant to be worked at slowly, tucked into a cheek and allowed to soften over the better part of an hour, less a snack and more a long-term project. Children gnaw on it the way kids elsewhere might work through a piece of hard candy, and it turns out to be an excellent source of both protein and, unintentionally,
an entire morning's worth of jaw exercise. There's a reason breakfast doesn't involve much cooking. Fuel is precious, time in the morning is short, and a household about to spend the day herding, milking, and moving does not want to be tethered to a stove. So the meal leans entirely on dairy that's already been prepared days or weeks earlier, dried, fermented, or boiled down into something shelf-stable, requiring nothing now but a bowl and a little patience. Ever grabbed a protein bar on your way out the door because you didn't have time for a real breakfast? This is the Steppe's ancient, considerably chewier answer to the exact same problem. Nothing here spoils quickly, nothing requires refrigeration, and everything can be eaten on horseback if the morning gets away from you, which, out here, it very often does. By the time the bowl is empty, and the last stubborn piece of our rule has finally softened enough to actually chew properly, the animals outside are already stirring, and you realize breakfast wasn't really a meal so much as fuel, dispensed efficiently and without ceremony, so the actual work of the day can begin. Let's talk about the drink you've been quietly dreading since someone mentioned it last night. Ayrag is mare's milk left to ferment in a large hide bag, churned relentlessly for hours until it turns tangy, faintly fizzy, and mildly alcoholic. It's offered to you with real pride because this isn't just a beverage here, it's a seasonal ritual, a social lubricant, and something close to a national identity poured into a wooden bowl. You take a sip expecting the worst and discover it's oddly refreshing, in the specific way that things are refreshing right up until your third bowl, at which point refreshing becomes a much more complicated word. The process alone is a full-body commitment. Fresh mare's milk gets poured into a large leather or hide vessel, and then someone, often whoever happens to be walking past, gives it a good churn with a wooden paddle, over and over, sometimes for hours at a stretch, sometimes for days, as the batch continues fermenting. The milk turns thinner, sourer, and slightly carbonated as wild yeasts and bacteria go to work, essentially turning the family entryway into an unsupervised brewery that nobody thought to license. The result lands somewhere between yogurt drink and very light beer, with an alcohol content low enough that you could, in theory, drink quite a lot of it and still function, though in theory is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. During the summer months, when mares are producing the most milk, Ayrag season becomes something close to a festival, with households competing quietly over whose batch has the best tang and proper fizz. Refusing a bowl when it's offered isn't really an option, not because anyone will force the issue, but because turning down hospitality out here carries a social weight you don't want to test on your first visit. So you drink, you nod appreciatively, and you try very hard not to make the face everyone makes on their first genuine mouthful. Ever been handed a drink at a party you didn't order, didn't fully understand, and felt obligated to finish anyway while smiling? Ayrag is that exact experience, except the party has been going on for roughly 1,000 years, and the host genuinely cannot understand why you're hesitating. By your second bowl, something shifts. The sourness stops being alarming and starts being interesting. By your third, you're beginning to understand why an entire culture built a season around this drink, why guests are honoured with it,
and why turning it down would be like refusing dessert at your grandmother's table. You'll pay for that third bowl later, in ways nobody warns you about. But for now, sitting in the sun with a slightly fizzy bowl of fermented mare's milk in your hand, you feel, against all expectation, completely at home. Let's talk about the animals, because your entire economy is walking around outside on 4 legs. Herders here speak of the 5 snouts: horses, cattle, camels, sheep and goats, and each one earns its keep in milk, meat, wool or transportation, often all 4. Milking happens daily, by hand, usually by the women of the household, moving calmly between animals who have long since stopped finding the process interesting. It's unglamorous, repetitive work that keeps the entire household fed, and it happens rain, shine, or bone-cracking cold, because livestock, unlike people, do not believe in sleeping in. You watch as the household moves through its animals with an ease that borders on choreography. Goats first, since they're quick and mildly impatient. Sheep next, calmer and more cooperative. Cattle after that, their milk richer and slower to give. Camels, when their season allows, offer milk with a flavour all its own, and horses, when the timing is right, provide the raw material for that bowl of ayrag you're still recovering from. Each animal serves multiple roles depending on the season and the need. Sheep provide wool for felt, meat for the pot, and milk for the table. Camels haul the entire household during a move and can survive stretches of scarce water that would flatten any other animal here. Cattle plod along steadily, useful and unglamorous. Horses do everything: transportation, war, sport, status, and yes, dairy, making them by a wide margin the most valued animals on the steppe, treated with a mixture of deep practical respect and genuine affection. The milking itself is quiet work, done crouched low beside each animal, hands moving in a steady rhythm while a bucket slowly fills. It's not romantic. It's cold in winter and swarmed by flies in summer, and it happens twice a day without fail, because an animal that isn't milked on schedule quickly lets everyone know about it. Ever complained about your morning commute making you late for work? Here, the herd doesn't care about your schedule, your mood, or how cold your fingers are. The animals need attention at the same time every single day, and the household's entire food supply depends on someone showing up to provide it. It's less a job and more a covenant, one your ancestors apparently signed on your behalf several centuries ago without asking. By midday, the buckets are full. The milk has been separated into what will become tea, cheese, yogurt, and eventually more ayrag, and you've gained a new appreciation for every carton of milk you've ever casually poured over cereal without a single thought for the animal, the hands, or the freezing early morning that made it possible. Let's talk about horses. Because out here, riding isn't a hobby. It's basically a second form of walking. Children are placed in the saddle almost as soon as they can sit upright, often riding alongside an adult before they've fully mastered stairs. And by the time they're old enough for real chores, they're expected to handle a horse at a full gallop without much fuss. It's less a skill you learn and more a language you're born speaking, and by adulthood,
A good rider can do everything from herding to archery from horseback, all while making it look like the horse is doing most of the thinking. You watch a child no older than 6 tear across open ground at a full gallop, completely unbothered, chasing down a stray goat with a kind of casual confidence you have never once felt behind the wheel of a car. Nobody applauds. Nobody films it. It's simply Tuesday, the same way learning to ride a bicycle might be for a child elsewhere. Except the stakes, the speed, and the sheer size of the animal involved are considerably higher. The horses themselves are smaller and stockier than the ones you might picture from storybooks, tough, sure-footed, and built for endurance rather than elegance. They graze year-round, even through brutal winters, digging through snow with their hooves to reach the grass beneath, a skill that makes them remarkably self-sufficient compared to horses almost anywhere else in the world. A household might own dozens of them, some for riding, some for milk, some simply grazing in reserve for whenever they're needed. Riding here isn't formal instruction so much as constant immersion. Nobody sits a child down for a lesson. The child is simply placed on the horse, held steady at first, then gradually given more control, until one day the training wheels, so to speak, are removed, and nobody quite remembers when. By the time a rider reaches adulthood, they can shoot an arrow, rope an animal, or nap, apparently, all without needing to think about the horse beneath them at all. Ever watched someone parallel park with visible effort and felt second-hand embarrassment on their behalf? Here, a 10-year-old can control a galloping horse with nothing but their knees, while their hands are busy doing something else entirely, and it would not occur to anyone to be impressed. By evening, as the horses are brought in and tethered for the night, you find yourself watching them with something closer to respect than curiosity. They're not decoration, and they're not sport, not primarily. They're partners, in every sense of the word, and the bond between rider and horse out here runs so deep that entire wars, entire empires will eventually be built on exactly this relationship, one small child on horseback at a time. Let's talk about the land itself, because it stretches in every direction with an indifference that's almost impressive. Grass rolls out to a horizon that never seems to get any closer, broken occasionally by a low hill, a distant herd, or absolutely nothing at all. There are no street signs, no fences, no helpful little markers, only sky, grass, and a herder's memorized sense of rivers, hills, and stars. Getting lost out here isn't a minor inconvenience, it's a genuine hazard. And yet somehow, the people who live here navigate it with the same casual confidence you might use to find your own bathroom in the dark. You stand at the edge of camp and try, honestly try, to spot some feature worth remembering. A tree, a rock, anything that might help you find your way back later. There isn't much to work with. The steppe rolls on in gentle waves of grass, the same shade of green or gold depending on the season, repeating itself with a consistency that would make any hiking app back home quietly give up and refund your subscription. And yet the people around you move through it with total certainty. A distant ridge that looks identical to the last 5 ridges apparently marks the turn toward good grazing. A particular bend in a river, invisible to you until you're standing right on top of it, tells a herder exactly how far they are from camp. The night sky becomes a working map,
Constellations doing the job your phone usually handles, minus the risk of the battery dying at the worst possible moment. This isn't casual knowledge either. It's built over a lifetime, passed down from parent to child through repetition rather than any written record, since a map, even if you had one, would be outdated the moment your camp moved again next season. The land itself becomes memory, every family holding its own private, unwritten atlas of a landscape that offers almost nothing in the way of obvious clues. Ever driven somewhere new relying entirely on GPS, only to have it lose signal at the exact wrong moment and feel a small flare of genuine panic? Now imagine that panic as your permanent baseline, except everyone around you seems to have simply opted out of ever needing directions at all. By the time the sun starts dropping toward the horizon, painting the grass in long gold light, you find yourself trusting the people around you completely. Not because you understand how they know where they're going, but because they clearly always have, long before you arrived and long after you'll be gone. The steppe doesn't hand out landmarks easily. It makes you earn every single one, and then it tests you on the exam without warning. Let's talk about the weather, because the steppe does not believe in moderation. Summers bring blistering heat and sudden, violent storms that roll in with almost no warning. Winters bring cold so severe it can freeze livestock where they stand, and in the worst years, a disaster called a zud arrives, a brutal combination of drought and deep snow that can wipe out entire herds and, with them, entire families' livelihoods. Herders read the sky the way city dwellers read a phone screen, constantly and with real consequences, because out here the forecast isn't background noise, it's survival. You feel the extremes yourself within a single day. Mornings arrive with a bite that makes your breath visible, while by midday, the sun bears down with a heat that makes you question every layer of that deal you were so grateful for at dawn. This is a continental climate at its most uncompromising, far from any ocean to soften the swings, which means the difference between summer and winter here isn't seasonal. It's practically a different planet. The zud is the word everyone says quietly, the way people elsewhere might mention a recession or a bad diagnosis. It happens when a dry summer leaves too little grass stored up, followed by a winter so harsh, so deeply snowed in, that animals can't reach what little grazing exists and can't survive the cold trying. A bad zud can kill a devastating percentage of a family's entire herd in a single season, transforming wealth into hardship almost overnight, with no insurance policy, no bailout, nothing but the slow work of rebuilding a herd from whatever animals survived. It's a stark reminder that the wealth here, expressed in animals rather than money, is only ever one brutal winter away from disappearing. Herders watch the sky obsessively for this reason, reading cloud patterns, wind shifts, and the behavior of the animals themselves for early warning signs, moving herds preemptively toward better shelter long before a storm actually announces itself. Ever checked the weather app 15 times in one morning before a big outdoor event, just to be safe? Multiply that anxiety by an entire household's survival, and you're somewhere close to how seriously the sky gets studied out here. Nobody complains about the forecast being wrong. Nobody needs to. The consequences of getting it wrong are written directly into how many animals are still standing come spring. By the time real winter sets in and the tent walls hold firm against the first serious storm,
You understand why every layer of felt, every strap of that moving household, every ounce of preparation matters so intensely. Out here, the weather isn't scenery. It's the single most powerful force in the room, and everyone, human and animal alike, has learned to respect it accordingly. Let's talk about how you keep a felt tent warm in the middle of a Mongolian winter, because the answer involves a fuel source that will test your composure. A small iron stove sits at the center of the gur, its chimney rising through that same hole in the roof, and it burns dried dung, mostly from cattle and horses, collected, dried, and stacked with the same seriousness other cultures reserve for firewood. It burns hot, clean, and remarkably free of smell once dried, which is either a small miracle or a very generous rounding of the truth, depending entirely on how close you're sitting. The collection itself is a whole household task, children included, wandering the grazing grounds with baskets, gathering what the animals have generously left behind. It's dried thoroughly in the sun until it's essentially a lightweight, odorless fuel brick, stacked in tidy piles outside the tent like firewood back home, minus any of the romantic mental imagery firewood usually carries. Once it's burning, the stove throws off a surprising amount of heat for something so compact, warming the entire round room within minutes and keeping it livable even as temperatures outside plunge to levels that would make most modern heating systems throw in the towel. The felt walls of the gur, layered thick and tightly wrapped, trap that warmth remarkably well, turning a structure that looks flimsy from the outside into something closer to a very effective thermos with a door. You sit close to the stove that first freezing night, hands out toward the heat, and find yourself grudgingly impressed. There's no odour to speak of, no acrid smoke stinging your eyes, just steady, dependable warmth radiating from a fuel source you would have, only a week ago, considered completely unusable. Necessity, it turns out, is an excellent teacher of open-mindedness. Ever complained about your thermostat cycling on and off all night, or your radiator clanking loud enough to wake the whole house? Out here, the fire needs to be tended, fed, and occasionally coaxed back to life by whoever draws the short straw closest to dawn. A job that requires actual human involvement rather than a dial on the wall, but delivers heat with a reliability that plenty of modern systems would envy. By the time the blizzard outside is in full howl, rattling against the felt walls and piling snow against the door, you're sitting comfortably inside in your layers, warmed by a fire built from a fuel source you now find yourself defending to an imaginary, skeptical audience back home. It works. It's efficient. It's endlessly renewable in the most literal sense possible. And it turns out that warmth, wherever it comes from, is warmth. And out here, you learn not to be picky about the source. Let's talk about privacy, a concept that exists here mostly in theory. An entire family, sometimes spanning 3 generations, lives, eats, sleeps, and argues within the same single round room, sorted only by that unspoken interior geography you learned earlier. Elders are treated with clear deference, children are given real responsibility early, and everyone's daily business is, by necessity, everyone else's business too. It builds a closeness that's hard to fake and even harder to escape. The kind where your grandmother knows exactly how much eidag you had last night before you've even opened your mouth. You notice quickly that nobody seems bothered by this arrangement the way you might expect. Conversations happen openly. Chores get divided without much discussion because everyone already knows their role. And disagreements, when they happen, get resolved quickly, if only because there's genuinely nowhere else to go to sulk about it. The oldest members of the household hold clear authority, their opinions carrying real weight in every decision, from where to move the herd next, to who a young person might eventually marry. Children, meanwhile, are folded into the working rhythm of the household early and completely. There's no separate category here for childhood as a protected, work-free stage of life. A child old enough to walk is generally old enough to help, fetching water, minding younger siblings, or keeping an eye on a wandering goat. Tasks handed over not as punishment, but as simple, expected participation in a household where every set of hands matters. The lack of physical privacy is balanced, somewhat, by a strong, unspoken respect for social privacy, an understanding of which conversations are for the whole tent, and which require a quieter word exchanged just outside. Ever tried to have a private phone call in a house full of family during the holidays? Stepping out onto the porch in the cold just to get 2 minutes alone? That instinct exists here too, minus the porch, replaced instead by a walk a short distance from the tent, where the wide open steppe offers more privacy than any closed door ever could. What emerges from all this closeness isn't chaos, but a kind of quiet efficiency, roles understood without negotiation, respect flowing naturally toward age and experience, and a bond between family members that's less a warm sentiment and more a working, load-bearing structure, as essential to daily survival as the felt walls themselves. By the time evening settles in and the whole family gathers again around the stove, sharing the last of the tea and the day's small stories, you understand that this isn't merely tolerance of close quarters. It's an entire social architecture built specifically for it, refined over generations to make sure a single round room can comfortably, if noisily, hold everyone a person loves most in the world. Let's talk about romance, steppe style, which occasionally comes with a theatrical flourish that would raise eyebrows anywhere else. Marriages are often arranged between families, sealed with gifts of livestock and careful negotiation. But tradition also preserves the custom of a playful, consensual bride abduction, a ritualized chase and capture performed with both families fully in on the plan. It looks dramatic from the outside, all galloping horses and mock resistance, but underneath the theatre, it's simply a wedding with better choreography than most modern ceremonies manage. You watch the negotiations unfold first, because that's really where most marriages here actually begin. Families discuss compatibility, status, and the practical matter of livestock, since a marriage joins not just two people, but two households worth of animals, land use, and future obligations. Gifts are exchanged, A dowry of animals often changes hands, and the whole arrangement gets settled with the seriousness of a business merger, because, in a very real sense, that's exactly what it is. The more theatrical version, when it happens, is understood by everyone involved as performance rather than genuine conflict. A symbolic echo of older, rougher customs long since softened into ceremony. The groom, or his representatives, ride out with real flourish. The bride offers a token show of resistance, and the whole camp treats the resulting chase with the same delighted attention you might give a particularly good scene in a movie you've already seen a dozen times. Once the marriage is settled, practical matters take over quickly. The couple is often gifted their own ger, sometimes constructed specifically for the occasion, along with a starting herd of animals meant to help them establish an independent household. It's less a honeymoon and more a fully equipped small business handed over on your wedding day, a level of practical generosity that makes a modern gift registry look almost quaint by comparison. Ever sat through a wedding speech that ran 20 minutes too long, filled with inside jokes you didn't understand? Out here, the equivalent might be an elder blessing the couple's future herd, with a speech about the specific bloodlines of the horses being gifted, and somehow it's every bit as heartfelt. By the time the ceremony wraps and the new couple settles into their own tent for the first time, surrounded by gifted animals and the goodwill of two families now formally joined, you realise the whole affair, dramatic entrance included, was never really about theatre at all. It was about building, quite literally from the ground up, a new household capable of surviving out here entirely on its own, which turns out to be the most romantic gesture the steppe really has to offer. Let's talk about childhood, which out here has very little patience for coddling. Children help herd livestock almost as soon as they can walk, learn to ride not long after, and are handed a small bough well before most children elsewhere are trusted with scissors. It's not cruelty, it's preparation, because a child who can't ride, herd, or shoot by adolescence is a child who's going to struggle badly once real responsibility arrives. The steppe doesn't really believe in childhood as a separate, protected stage of life. It believes in getting you ready. You watch a group of children practicing archery near camp, their small bows scaled down, but their focus entirely full-sized, releasing arrow after arrow at a target with a seriousness that would put most adult hobbyists to shame. Nobody's handing out participation trophies. A miss just means another try, and a hit earns nothing more than a small nod from whichever adult happens to be watching, which, out here, apparently counts as thunderous applause. Herding duties come early too, often starting with the easiest, most forgiving animals, goats and sheep, before graduating to cattle, and eventually the genuine responsibility of horses. A child might spend an entire afternoon alone with a portion of the herd, tracking their movement across open ground, watching for predators, and bringing them back safely by evening. A level of unsupervised responsibility that would raise several eyebrows back home, where a modern parent might hesitate before letting a 10-year-old walk to the corner store alone. This isn't neglect, though. It's trust built through steady exposure, each task calibrated to age and ability, expanding gradually until a teenager can competently manage nearly every aspect of the household's animals and equipment. Skills that might take years of formal lessons elsewhere are absorbed here simply by living inside them daily, the way you might learn to cook, not from a class, but from spending your whole childhood in a kitchen that never really closes. Ever watched a modern teenager struggle to change a tire or read a paper map, having grown up with none of the practical exposure their grandparents took for granted? Out here, that gap simply doesn't exist. A 12-year-old can saddle a horse, track a lost goat, and start a fire in under a blizzard's worth of wind. Skills earned not through any curriculum, but through years of simply being expected to help. By the time these children reach true adulthood, they're not being handed independence for the first time. They're stepping fully into a role they've already been quietly rehearsing for most of their lives. The steppe doesn't wait for you to be ready. It simply assumes, correctly, that if you grew up here, you already are. Let's talk about the 3 manly games: wrestling, archery, and horse racing. The events that turn any gathering of clans into something between a sporting event and a national holiday. Wrestlers grapple in loose, open-chested jackets, under rules that reward strength and balance over brute force. Archers hit distant leather targets with a composure that looks almost bored. And children, often no older than 7, race horses across brutal distances. Because here, the lightest rider wins, and nobody's especially squeamish about who that rider is. It's part sport, part military training, and part excuse for everyone to show off at once. You settle in among a crowd that's travelled considerable distances just to watch, the atmosphere closer to a festival than any formal competition, with food, music, and gossip flowing as freely as the events themselves. The wrestling starts first, competitors performing a small, eagle-inspired dance before each match, arms outstretched, part warm-up and part theatre, before locking together in a match where the goal is simple: get any part of your opponent besides the soles of their feet to touch the ground. There's no weight class here, no separating competitors by size, which means you occasionally watch a smaller wrestler use pure technique to topple someone twice their build. And the crowd's roar makes clear that this particular kind of upset is exactly what everyone showed up hoping to see. The winner performs a small celebratory gesture, mimicking a soaring bird, and the whole thing has the unmistakable feel of a tradition that hasn't needed updating in centuries because it simply already works. The archery competitions unfold with a stillness that feels almost meditative by comparison. Competitors sending arrows towards small, stacked targets from a distance that makes your own eyes ache just trying to see them properly. And then there's the horse racing, an event unlike anything you'd recognize from back home. Run over long, open distances with young children as jockeys, chosen deliberately for their light weight, trained from early childhood specifically for this moment, treated not as a curiosity, but as one of the highest honours a young rider can achieve. Ever watched a youth sports league back home debate for an hour over whether a game should even keep score? Here, 7-year-olds are competing in races that span miles of open steppe, cheered on by an entire community. And nobody's questioning whether it's appropriate. Because out here, competence has never really been tied to age in the first place. By the time the events wind down and the crowd begins drifting back toward their own camps, you understand these games were never really about entertainment alone. Wrestling builds strength, archery builds precision, and racing builds a bond between rider and horse that will matter for the rest of that child's life. All of it wrapped in a celebration so joyful, you'd almost forget it doubles as training for exactly the kind of world you're currently living in. Let's talk about war, because the same skills that get you through an ordinary Tuesday, riding, shooting, living light, happen to make you terrifyingly effective in a fight. Warriors carry a compact, powerful composite bow, capable of firing accurately from a full gallop, wear light armor built for speed rather than bulk, and can strike, retreat, and vanish back into the grassland before an enemy fully understands what happened. An entire army here can pack up and move like a household on a bad lease, which is precisely why so much of the known world is currently having a very difficult decade. You watch a warrior prepare that composite bow, layers of horn, wood, and sinew laminated together into something small enough to fire comfortably on horseback, yet powerful enough to punch through armor at a distance that seems almost unfair. It takes years to fully master, drawing and releasing at a full gallop, tracking a moving target, while your own platform is bouncing violently across open ground. A skill so demanding that most cultures elsewhere simply never developed cavalry archery to anything close to this level. The armor, where it exists, prioritizes mobility over protection, since an army built entirely around speed has little use for anything heavy enough to slow a horse down. Warriors travel with spare mounts, switching regularly to keep every horse fresh, allowing this cavalry to cover distances in days that would take other armies weeks, arriving somewhere an enemy assumed was still comfortably far away. Tactics lean heavily on discipline and deception, feigned retreats drawing overconfident enemies into pursuit, only to find the retreating force wheeling back around at full speed, arrows already in the air. Coordinated signals, flags by day and fire by night, let commanders direct enormous, fast-moving forces across terrain with a precision that European and Chinese armies of the same era found genuinely bewildering. Ever tried to coordinate a group project where half the team can't agree on a meeting time? Now imagine directing tens of thousands of mounted warriors across open terrain, with nothing but flags, fire, and absolute trust in the chain of command, and somehow making it look effortless. Underneath all of it sits the same portable, adaptable lifestyle you've been living in this tent all week. An army that can dismantle and relocate its entire camp overnight, that eats dry dairy and travels light, that has spent every childhood in the saddle, isn't built for war as a separate speciality. It's simply steppe life, redirected. By the time this particular chapter of history closes, the warriors who rode out from exactly this kind of camp will have reshaped the map of the known world, not through some secret weapon, but through skills every single person around you has been quietly practicing since before they could properly walk. Let's talk about how news actually travels across an empire this enormous, because the answer is a relay system so effective it would make a modern courier service blush. Riders gallop between a network of stations spaced roughly a day's ride apart, swapping to a fresh horse at each stop and passing messages onward at a pace that can cross unthinkable distances in days rather than months. It's called the yam, and it keeps the far edges of the empire in surprisingly quick contact with its centre, proving that long before anyone invented the mailbox, a tired horse and a determined rider could outrun almost anything. You watch a rider arrive at a relay station in a cloud of dust, barely slowing before dismounting, grabbing a fresh mount already saddled and waiting, and thundering off again within minutes. The stations themselves are simple but well stocked. Fresh horses, basic supplies, sometimes lodging, positioned with enough regularity across the empire's vast stretches that a message can, in theory, keep moving almost continuously, handed off from rider to rider like a relay race spanning thousands of miles. Urgent messages travel with riders wearing bells or specific markers announcing their priority, so that other travellers on the route know to clear the way immediately, the medieval equivalent of an ambulance siren cutting through traffic. The most pressing dispatches can supposedly cover distances in days that would take an ordinary traveller months. Information moving at a speed that genuinely startles merchants, diplomats, and rival rulers alike, all of whom are used to news travelling considerably slower. This system doesn't just carry messages, it carries authority. A functioning postal relay this reliable lets a ruler govern territory stretching across multiple modern countries without losing control the moment he looks away. Orders and reports flowing steadily in both directions, keeping distant generals, governors and merchants connected to a centre that might otherwise feel impossibly far removed. Ever been frustrated waiting for a package that says it will arrive in 2 days and then mysteriously takes 2 weeks? The YAM system operated with a reliability that puts plenty of modern logistics to shame. Built entirely on relay stations, disciplined riders, and a near religious respect for keeping fresh horses ready at every single stop along the route. By the time you've watched a handful of riders pass through, swapping horses with barely a pause for breath, you start to understand this network as something closer to nervous system than postal service. The empire's various limbs staying coordinated and aware of each other across distances that should, by any reasonable expectation, have made that coordination impossible. It's the quiet infrastructure behind everything else you've witnessed here. The reason a ruler camped in one corner of the steppe can still command armies, negotiate with distant cities, and hear news from the far edges of his territory before it's even had time to grow stale. Let's talk about the man whose name is currently reorganizing several continents. Genghis Khan rules not from a palace, but from a mobile court that moves with the seasons, like everyone else's household, and governs through a code of law called the Yasa, covering everything from military discipline to surprisingly practical rules about theft and hospitality. Loyalty is rewarded generously, betrayal is punished without much patience, and merit, unusually for the era, often matters more than birth. It's less a throne room than a very well-organised, extremely mobile headquarters, run by a man who apparently never met a horizon he didn't want to own. You watch as the court assembles, not in some fixed stone building, but in a cluster of larger, more elaborate gurs, still built on the same felt and lattice principles as your own tent, just considerably grander and surrounded by considerably more guards. Advisors, generals, and representatives from conquered or allied territories move through this mobile capital, conducting the business of an empire from a setting that could, if the season demanded it, be packed onto camels and relocated by tomorrow. The yasa itself functions as something between a legal code and a set of hard-earned survival rules, forged from the practical lessons of steppe life and expanded to govern a rapidly growing empire. Rules address military conduct, theft, the treatment of merchants and messengers, even hunting practices meant to preserve resources for leaner seasons. Punishments tend to be swift and severe, but the code also enshrines protections that feel strikingly progressive for the era. Religious tolerance among them, since a ruler governing this many different peoples has quickly learned that forcing everyone into a single faith creates far more problems than it solves. What genuinely surprises you is the emphasis on merit. Loyalty and demonstrated ability can elevate someone from modest origins into genuine positions of command, a meritocratic streak that stands out sharply against the rigid inherited hierarchies common elsewhere in this era. Skilled generals, capable administrators, and reliable messengers can rise regardless of the family they were born into, provided they prove themselves reliably useful to the empire's relentless expansion. Ever worked somewhere that claimed to promote based on merit, only to watch the boss's nephew get the corner office anyway? Out here, at least according to the code everyone claims to live by, competence genuinely outranks connections, an approach that helps explain how this empire managed to grow so explosively in such a short span of time. By the time you leave the court behind, you're struck less by the grandeur, since there isn't much of it in the conventional sense, and more by the sheer organizational discipline holding it all together. No palace walls, no permanent throne room, just a set of clear rules, a talented and loyal inner circle, and a ruler apparently willing to relocate his entire seat of power as easily as any herder relocates a tent, provided the horizon still has more to offer. Let's talk about what people out here believe in, because the steppe's spiritual life is as vast and open as its landscape. The dominant faith centers on Tengri, the eternal blue sky, worshipped as the ultimate source of order and fortune, with shamans acting as intermediaries who read omens, perform rituals, and occasionally fall into dramatic trances to communicate with the spirit world. Sacred cairns called ovu dot the landscape, stacked with stones and offerings by travellers passing through, a small, quiet gesture of respect to a sky that, out here, is very hard to ignore. You pass one of these ovu on your travels, a modest pile of stones topped with blue cloth strips fluttering in the wind, and you watch as your companion circles it clockwise 3 times before adding a stone of their own, murmuring something under their breath that you don't quite catch. It's a small ritual, quick and unhurried, part prayer and part habit, performed the way someone else might casually knock on wood, except with considerably more spiritual sincerity behind it. Tengri isn't worshipped through grand temples or elaborate scripture, but through a lived relationship with the sky itself, vast, watchful, and directly responsible for good weather, successful hunts, and general fortune. The blue colour that appears everywhere, from those cloth strips on the ovu to certain ceremonial items, is a direct nod to that endless overhead expanse everyone here has spent their entire life staring up into. Shamans hold a genuinely important role, called upon to heal illness, interpret dreams, guide important decisions, and communicate directly with ancestral or nature spirits believed to inhabit rivers, mountains, and specific patches of land. Their rituals can involve drumming, chanting, and trance states dramatic enough to draw a crowd, a kind of spiritual consultation that treats the natural and supernatural worlds as continuous rather than separate. Ever nervously avoided walking under a ladder, or knocked on wood after saying something you probably shouldn't have jinxed? Multiply that instinct across an entire belief system, one where mountains have spirits worth respecting, and the sky itself is owed genuine reverence, and you're closer to understanding how deeply this worldview shapes daily behavior out here, from which direction a tent door faces to how carefully a traveler treats a simple pile of stones. By the time you continue on your way, leaving the Uvu behind, you notice you've unconsciously slowed your pace near it too, some quiet instinct nudging you toward respect, even without fully understanding the specifics. It's a belief system built not around distant, abstract doctrine, but around the very ground, sky, and weather that define every single day out here, which might explain why it fits this landscape so seamlessly that it barely feels like religion at all. It just feels like paying attention to where you actually are. Let's talk about the strangers who occasionally wander into your otherwise quiet stretch of grassland, because the steppe sits astride some of the busiest trade routes on Earth. Merchants pass through with silk, spices, and precious metals, protected in part by the very empire whose warriors terrify everyone else, since a unified Mongol rule has made these roads safer than they've been in generations. Goods, ideas, and the occasional foreign diplomat drift through camp, turning even a remote patch of grass into an unexpected crossroads of the known world. You watch a small caravan approach, dust rising behind heavily loaded camels, the merchants dismounting with the particular weariness of people who have already been travelling far longer than seems reasonable. They're welcomed with the same hospitality you received on your own arrival, offered tea, a place by the fire, and a chance to trade news along with goods, since out here, information travels almost as valuably as silk does. Their packs hold treasures that feel almost absurdly out of place against the felt walls and dried dung fuel of camp life, bolts of shimmering silk, small chests of spices whose smell alone seems worth the journey, fine metalwork, and the occasional curious trinket from some distant city whose name you don't recognize. In exchange, they're often after furs, livestock, or the sturdy felt goods this region produces so reliably, a trade relationship built on each side having exactly what the other genuinely needs. What makes this particular moment in history remarkable is the relative safety of the roads themselves. Under a single unified authority stretching across an enormous swathe of territory, bandit activity that once made these routes genuinely dangerous has been sharply curtailed. Merchants moving with a confidence that would have seemed reckless just a generation earlier. It's occasionally called, by later historians who clearly appreciate a tidy phrase, a kind of peace that lets trade flourish precisely because one power controls so much ground that crossing it no longer means constantly renegotiating safety with a dozen different local rulers. Ever been amazed at how quickly a package ordered from the other side of the world shows up on your doorstep, and given surprisingly little thought to the actual infrastructure making that possible? This caravan, dusty and exhausted as it looks, is doing essentially the same job, just measured in months instead of days, and considerably more dependent on the weather cooperating. By the time the merchants pack up and continue on toward the next camp, next city, next unimaginable distance, you're left with a small taste of something exotic, a spice you can't quite name, and a genuine sense of how connected this supposedly remote stretch of grassland actually is to a world far larger than the horizon in front of you ever suggested. Let's talk about dinner, which tends to be built almost entirely around meat, since crops don't have much interest in growing on windswept grassland. Mutton and goat are staples, often prepared as budog, where the meat is cooked from the inside out using stones heated in the fire and packed directly into the animal's cavity, a method that sounds alarming and produces something genuinely tender. Nothing goes to waste, seasoning is minimal, and the whole process is a reminder that out here, cooking is less about flavor experimentation and more about turning what you have into what you need. You watch the preparation with a mixture of fascination and mild concern. Stones heated until they're glowing hot, then carefully placed inside the cleaned carcass, along with the meat itself. The whole thing sealed and set near the fire while the heat works its way outward from the inside. A genuine reversal of how you've cooked meat your entire life. There's no oven involved, no elaborate spice rack, just fire, stone, and patience. The result, once it's finally ready, is remarkably tender, the meat having essentially steamed itself from within, falling away from the bone with minimal effort. Seasoning stays simple, mostly salt, since out here flavour comes less from added spice and more from the quality of the animal itself, raised on open grazing land rather than anything resembling a feedlot. Every part of the animal gets used, a practical necessity rather than a culinary trend, since raising livestock out here takes real effort, and letting any part go to waste would be, frankly, a bit insulting to the animal and the herder both. Organs, fat, and less conventional cuts all find their way into the pot eventually, nothing wasted, nothing thrown away simply because it looks unfamiliar. Ever watched a cooking show obsess over some elaborate technique involving a sous vide machine and 45 precisely measured ingredients? Here, dinner is prepared using heated rocks and the animal's own body as the cooking vessel, and somehow the result rivals anything that fancy machine could produce, minus the electricity bill and the instruction manual nobody actually reads. By the time the meal is finally served, gathered around with the whole family reaching in together, you understand that this isn't cooking as entertainment or performance. It's cooking as pure efficiency, refined by necessity into something that manages, almost by accident, to also taste incredible. There's no dining room, no fine china, just a shared meal eaten with your hands beside a fire that's been doing double duty as both heat source and kitchen appliance all day long. And somehow, it feels like exactly the right way to end a day spent entirely on the steppe. Let's talk about hygiene, a subject the steppe treats with a certain relaxed indifference. Water is often scarce, especially in winter, so full baths are rare, and cleanliness leans more on wiping down, airing out clothing, and the practical wisdom of wool, which apparently resists odour far better than modern fabric ever will. It's not a world obsessed with fragrance, and by the time you've been here a week, neither, somehow, are you. You quickly learn that water out here is treated as precious, used first and foremost for drinking, cooking, and the animals, with bathing landing fairly far down the priority list, especially once winter locks rivers and streams under a thick layer of ice. A quick wipe down with a damp cloth becomes the standard approach, focused practically on hands and face, the parts of you actually doing the day's work and therefore actually getting dirty. Your deal, meanwhile, does a surprising amount of the heavy lifting. Wool has a natural resistance to odour that synthetic fabrics simply can't match, absorbing moisture without holding on to smell the way you might expect, which means the same outfit can be worn for days, even weeks, without the kind of consequences that would be immediate and obvious back home. Clothing gets aired out regularly, hung near the fire or draped over a line outside, rather than washed constantly, since washing wool in freezing water is both unpleasant and, frankly, unnecessary as often as you'd assume. There's a practical wisdom underneath all this that took modern society considerably longer to rediscover. Overwashing wears out fabric, wastes precious water, and, as it turns out, isn't actually required nearly as often as advertising back home would have you believe. Out here, the standard is simpler. Stay reasonably clean, keep your clothing aired, and accept that a certain amount of earthy wood smoke and wool smell is simply the natural signature of a life spent largely outdoors. Ever felt weirdly virtuous skipping a shower because you were conserving water, only to feel slightly guilty about it 20 minutes later? Out here, that's not guilt-inducing at all. It's just Tuesday, and nobody's going to judge you for it. Mostly because they're operating under the exact same relaxed standard themselves. By the time you've fully adjusted, you find the anxiety about odour and cleanliness that once felt so automatic has quietly faded, replaced by a much simpler calculus. Are you warm? Are you dry? And does your wool still smell more like wood smoke than anything genuinely unpleasant? It's a low bar, deliberately so, and one that turns out to be perfectly sufficient for a life spent almost entirely outdoors, wrapped in a fabric that, against all modern expectation, is quietly doing an excellent job the whole time. Let's talk about music, because evenings out here tend to end with sound rather than screens. The morin kur, a two-stringed fiddle carved with a horse's head at its top, produces a low, resonant tone that seems to match the landscape itself. And then there's throat singing, kumi, where a single performer produces two tones at once, a low drone and an eerie whistling melody layered on top, a sound that seems less like a performance and more like the wind decided to join in. You settle in near the fire as the evening's music begins, the morin kur's carved horsehead catching the firelight, its two strings drawn with a bow to produce a sound that's deep, slightly rough, and unmistakably tied to the animal whose likeness tops the instrument. The connection isn't just decorative either. Legend traces the instrument's origin back to a grieving herder who built it in memory of a beloved horse, and the sound it makes still carries something of that same mournful, loyal quality. Then the throat singing starts, and you find yourself genuinely unsure for a moment whether what you're hearing is actually coming from one person. The performer holds a low, steady drone in their throat, while simultaneously shaping a higher, whistling overtone above it, two distinct pitches from a single set of vocal cords, a technique that takes years of practice to control and sounds, frankly, like it shouldn't be physically possible. The songs themselves often draw directly from the landscape and the life within it, galloping horses, wide open grasslands, distant mountains, the changing seasons, subjects pulled straight from the world just outside the tent door, rather than anything abstract or invented. It's music built to be performed outdoors, under open sky, meant to carry across distance the same way a herder's call might reach a horse grazing far from camp. Ever put on a song specifically because it matched the exact mood of the landscape you were driving through, mountains or coastline syncing perfectly with whatever was playing? This is that instinct in its purest, oldest form. Music composed not to accompany the land, but to genuinely sound like it. Echoing wind, hoofbeats, and distance in ways a synthesizer back home would need considerable effort to fake. By the time the last notes fade and the fire burns down to embers, you understand why this music has survived so cleanly across centuries without needing much reinvention. It isn't trying to compete with the landscape for attention. It's simply translating it, turning wind, hoofbeats, and grief into something you can actually hear. And somehow, sitting there in the dark with the stars just beginning to emerge overhead, it feels like the most natural soundtrack imaginable. Let's talk about the wildlife, because sharing this landscape means sharing it with animals who are not especially impressed by your presence. Wolves are a genuine constant threat to herds, respected and feared in roughly equal measure. Golden eagles, meanwhile, are trained by skilled hunters to hunt foxes and hares, a partnership built on patience and trust between a person and a bird large enough to be mildly concerning up close. Out here, the wildlife isn't background scenery. It's a daily negotiation. You hear the wolves before you ever see one, a distant howl carrying easily across open ground on a still night, close enough to make every dog in camp respond immediately, and every herder's attention sharpen without a word needing to be exchanged. Wolves have hunted these grasslands for as long as the herds have grazed them, and the relationship between the two is old, adversarial, and mutually well understood. Herders protecting their animals fiercely while still holding a kind of grudging respect for a predator this capable and this deeply woven into the landscape's own mythology. Livestock get watched closely at dusk and through the night, dogs kept nearby specifically for early warning. Herds move towards safer, more defensible ground whenever wolves are known to be active in the area. It's a constant, low-grade vigilance, the rural equivalent of double-checking that you locked the front door. Except the consequence of forgetting is considerably higher than a moment of anxiety at midnight. The eagles, by contrast, represent an entirely different relationship with the region's more formidable wildlife. Cooperation rather than defense. Trained from a young age, these enormous birds work alongside hunters, particularly in certain communities where eagle hunting has become both a practical skill and a genuine point of cultural pride. Soaring out from a hunter's outstretched arm to take down foxes or hares with a speed and precision no human could hope to match unaided. Ever watched a nature documentary and thought, with real confidence, that you could never personally handle an animal that intimidating? The hunters here disagree entirely, raising these eagles from chicks, building a bond of trust so complete that a bird easily capable of doing serious damage to a person instead returns obediently to a gloved arm after every single hunt. An image that manages to look both completely serene and mildly terrifying at exactly the same time. By the time night fully falls and the wolves' distant calls fade into a general watchfulness rather than active alarm, you realize this entire landscape operates on a kind of continuous negotiation between people and the animals sharing it. Some treat it as threats to guard against, others as partners to train and trust completely. And the wisdom to know precisely which is which, passed down as carefully as any other skill this place demands. Let's talk about the end of the day, because nightfall out here arrives with a silence that feels almost solid. Without a single city light for hundreds of miles, the sky fills with more stars than you knew existed, and the family gathers close to the hearth to trade stories, proverbs, and the kind of quiet, easy conversation that doesn't need a screen to hold anyone's attention. It's the softest part of an otherwise demanding day, and it's about to become the last thing you remember before sleep finally catches up with you. You step outside the tent one last time before settling in, and the sky stops you completely. There's no glow on any horizon, no scattered light pollution softening the edges of anything. Just an overwhelming, almost unreasonable density of stars stretching from one edge of the world to the other. A sight so complete, it takes a moment to remember you're supposed to be doing something other than simply staring upward with your mouth slightly open. Back inside, the fire has settled into a low, steady glow, and the family arranges itself in that familiar geography you've finally learned to navigate without thinking. Stories get told, some clearly well-worn favourites requested specifically by the youngest listeners. Others new, picked up from that merchant caravan or a distant relative's recent visit. News and folklore blending together with no clear line between where one ends and the other begins. There's a rhythm to it, unhurried and entirely unbothered by the idea that anyone might need to be somewhere else. Proverbs get dropped into ordinary conversation with the casual confidence of wisdom that's been tested for generations. Small, tidy phrases about weather, animals, and patience that somehow apply to whatever situation just came up, whether or not that connection was strictly intentional. Ever spent an evening completely without your phone, maybe during a power outage, and been startled by how genuinely long, an unstructured conversation can actually stretch when nothing is competing for your attention? This is that same stretch of unhurried time, except it's not an accident here. It's simply how every single evening ends, night after night, season after season, for as long as anyone in this tent can remember. Eventually, the stories slow, the fire burns lower, and one by one, the family settles into their sleeping mats along the walls, the stove still glowing faintly at the centre of it all. You lie back, wrapped snugly enough against the cold, listening to the quiet shifting of the herd somewhere outside, and the occasional low murmur of someone not quite ready for the day to fully end. The sky is still out there, endless and impossibly bright, and somewhere beneath it, an entire life built on movement, resilience, and quiet resourcefulness has, for tonight at least, finally come to rest. So here you are, at the end of a day that started with a felt roof over your head and ends with an entire galaxy over it instead. You've packed a household onto the backs of camels, learned to sit in exactly the right corner of a one-room home, choked down a bowl of something fermented with genuine pride, and watched a 7-year-old outride you without breaking a sweat. It was cramped, it was cold, it occasionally smelled like dried dung and wet wool, and somehow none of that made it feel any less like a place worth belonging to. There's something quietly humbling about a life built entirely around movement, where nothing is permanent except the sky above you and the people beside you. The Mongol herders you spent today with didn't need walls to build a home, or a mailbox to build an empire, or a single fixed address to build one of the largest connected civilizations the world had ever seen. They built it on trust, on horses, on knowing exactly which star to follow when the grass ran out. That's not survival by accident. That's centuries of hard-won wisdom, carried lightly enough to fit on the back of an ox, and passed down carefully enough to still be alive today, in gurs scattered across that same endless grassland. So tonight, as you sink into your own bed, the one that has stayed in exactly the same spot for as long as you've owned it, with walls that don't fold up, water that comes out of a tap instead of a frozen river, and absolutely no wolves to listen for, take a quiet moment of gratitude. For stillness, for plumbing, for the fact that your entire life doesn't need to fit on a camel by sunrise. And maybe, just maybe, let a small part of you wonder what it would feel like to sleep under that many stars, just once. Sleep well. The steppe will still be there in the morning. It always is.